They have been sick, and Steve and Glenda have been out a little while. I'm glad they are feeling well enough to be with us today. Thank the Lord for that. Ms. Turner, good to see you. And, this fellow over here doesn't officially need a visitor card. The fellow over here in the purple shirt, this is Harvey Meisler. So they've been faithfully, watching the live stream services when he wasn't able to be here. And I know that they faithfully did because, they would contact us and ask questions if the stream wasn't working or whatever, and that's a help to us to know what we need to do. But good to see you, Brother Harvey. Glad that you're able to be here with us today. Appreciate that. Appreciate the Lord lifting you up. Glad for our regular folks, our regular attenders to be here. I don't know how many of us are regular or normal. Normal's just a setting on the dryer. That's pretty much all it is. But anyway, I'm glad for the rest of you to be here. We've got another visitor this morning. This is not, somebody from the neighborhood that just walked in. If you didn't see Jed Duarte this morning, great to see you, Jed. The last update we had was that they were shooting for tomorrow to try to make the trip back with the plane to Brazil, but that is not on track. And I could give the update, or I can have you give it. Why don't you just give us an update? All right, come on up here so everybody can hear you. And Charlie, we'll just use the center mic here for a second. We'd give you more time, but you didn't bring Gloria and Eliana.
I know. Good morning. It's good to see each one. You all know who I am. Anyways, with the airplane, U.S. side, we finally got everything ready. Yesterday, we were supposed to take it up to Montgomery, near Nashville, and do the last inspection to get the airplane down. And then we realized that in the Brazil side, this is the first time our mission, or Aero Missions, is actually doing this. So we're learning. We realized that in the Brazil side, there's still a lot of paperwork that we probably should have all lined up for there to be no issues, especially because this is a ministry. It's a ministry and not anything else. So that pushes back to about probably 2 months from now. So on Thursday, I get back to Brazil. Can't wait to see my family. This is the longest I've been away from them, and miss them a lot. But we're all doing well. Been staying busy. In about 2 months, we're moving to Alta Floresta, Lord willing, and looking forward to that, to the next chapter. It'll be the fifth time we move in little less than a year and a half. So we'll be more than happy to finally settle down and get busy. So, thank you.
Well, great to see you. And don't take this the wrong way, but next time we see you, we want to see Gloria and Eliana too. So I know he's anxious to get back and be reunited with his family. So it'll be about the same time that you hope to get the plane back that you're hoping to get to Alta Floresta then. So yeah, that's good. Less paperwork is always better. So, do you have anything rented yet in Alta Floresta, a place to live or a place to meet with the church or anything? Okay. So when they go back, they'll start looking for housing and a potential meeting place for the church and stuff like that. So that's another way that we can pray for the Duarte family there. And it's exciting to see how the Lord's used them. And if you were here, I guess it was last Sunday night. I think it was last Sunday night. We showed the video update to the church. But young people that have been saved, and and things that the Lord's used them to do while they're doing furlough fill-in for another missionary, and still working on language school and all of that. So anyway, we'll continue to pray for the Duarte family. Jeremy and Esther are here today, but his meetings are picking back up. So continue to pray for his work there with Worldwide Mission in Kings Mountain and all of his varied responsibilities. It's pretty much other duties as assigned, right? So continue to pray that God will use his family there. Gabe and Susan Iben in Pohnpei are serving the Lord faithfully there in whatever avenues the Lord opens for them. And right now they're focusing on in addition to the radio ministry, the children's ministries through, I believe it's Calvary Baptist. I believe that's the church that the radio station's associated with there. But continue to pray for Gabe and Susan there. And then Frank and Jenny Maeda in Italy are serving faithfully, and Lord willing, late summer they're coming back to the U.S. for a furlough. We'll get to see them, I believe, and they have children who are preparing for college or next step of life. So let's pray for their family and those transitions as well. All right. So let's go to the Lord in prayer. Ask His blessings on our missionaries and on our Sunday school hour today. And Brother Steve, are you up to praying for us this morning? All right. If you can lift your voice, would you do that for us, please? Amen. All right, we are in the book of Zephaniah, and if you have no idea where that is, go to Matthew, and then back up about 3 or 4 small books, and you'll be there. We're doing a survey of the minor prophets. Well, it might be a little more than a survey, but it's not a true verse by verse. But we're trying to connect the minor prophets and their ministries along with the timeline of the history of Israel. So the time of Zephaniah is just before the fall of Nineveh. If you remember, the last couple of books that we've looked at have included prophecies about the destruction of Nineveh. This book of Zephaniah also prophesies the destruction of Nineveh. Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian world empire, and the Assyrian empire was the major power in that part of the world at this time, approximately 625 BC. The fall of Nineveh was, depending on which historian you look at, 612, 610 BC, along in there. And then, shortly after the fall of Nineveh, Nineveh was captured by Babylon. And then as Babylon comes into power, very shortly thereafter, they came and conquered Jerusalem. So Zephaniah is preaching during that time frame. He lived in Jerusalem at the same time as the prophet Jeremiah. So Jeremiah and Zephaniah no doubt knew each other, and their ministries overlap to a certain degree. All right, and we left off in the end of chapter 2 last time. In chapter 2, we have basically 4 groups of people. It's God's judgment, and we said before that if you look at these from the perspective of Israel, we put the map up here last week and showed you that from the perspective of Israel, these groups that are receiving God's judgment are basically north, south, west, east. Okay, so it encompasses basically all directions, or sometimes the Bible talks about the 4 corners of heaven or the 4 corners of the earth, meaning kind of an all-encompassing term. But we looked at that, the group immediately to the west. That would be from my direction, it would be this way. If you're thinking of the map from your direction, it would be to the west or to the left from Israel. That would be the Philistines. And we saw last week God's judgment on the Philistines in verses 4 through 7. In verses 8 through 11, we have God's judgment on Moab and Ammon. 2 other groups. Those groups were descendants from the illegitimate offspring of Lot. And if you remember, we left off last time saying that just like Lot was involved in Sodom and Gomorrah, and when God judged them, God, when He's speaking to Moab and Ammon in verse 9, says, He made that comparison. I'm going to judge you just as I did Sodom and Gomorrah. Verse 11, the Lord will be terrible unto them, meaning fearful, or His judgment will cause fear on the part of the people. All right, now that brings us to the next section here, verses 12 through 15 in Zephaniah chapter 2. Ye Ethiopians also, ye shall be slain by my sword, and he will stretch out his hand against the north, and destroy Assyria. So Moab and Ammon, that would be groups to the south and somewhat to the east of Israel, but more east than south. Okay? Here, the Ethiopians, that is south of Egypt. Sometimes in the prophets, there's a distinction made between Egypt and Ethiopia. Sometimes they are kind of related because there were times during the different world empires and rulers and such that, Ethiopia and Egypt were all, one area as far as governance and such. But that would be definitely to the south. So that would be in the northern part of Africa, but it's definitely to the south from the perspective of Israel. And then, so verse 12, ye Ethiopians, you shall be slain by my sword. So that's the group to the south in verse number 12. Okay, Nahum, which we studied just before this, also mentions that same group. Ethiopia is Cush, is the Hebrew word for it. So the Cushites are sometimes mentioned that way in the Old Testament. It's the same group there. Verse 13, he will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria. Now, Nineveh was the capital of Assyria, and from our map perspective, it was more like northeast, like 2 o'clock or so on the clock. But remember, the trade routes to travel, you would have to kind of follow what is called the Fertile Crescent, but they would have to go north and then kind of follow the Tigris-Euphrates River back down, because due east of Israel is what's today Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Iran, but a whole lot of desert that wasn't conducive for land travel. So even though Assyria is more northeast, it is referred to as north because that's the direction they always came from. They would come over and then come down from north to south when they were coming against Israel. He will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria, and will make Nineveh a desolation and dry like a wilderness. Now, the last few weeks we haven't had to worry about dry like a wilderness too much, have we? It's actually kind of the opposite. If you park your car on the driveway and you have to step off on the grass to get to it, you're afraid your shoes are going to be muddy, when you step in the car, right? But this term here is the opposite of that. It is dry, like a wilderness. So the idea of desert, okay? So water is necessary for life, because without water you cannot make coffee, okay? No, but water is necessary for life, all right? And so when there's no water, when there's drought, the rivers and the wells and the springs dry up, you got a problem. And so he says, I will stretch out my hand against the north and destroy Assyria, and will make Nineveh a desolation. So Nineveh being the capital city. When we talked about Nahum, we talked more about Nineveh's situation, but it was situated on the Tigris, and there was another tributary river, so it was basically protected on 2 sides by water. Very well-supplied city, very fortified city. That would be almost like saying that a city in Egypt on the Nile River would be a wilderness, or a city in South America. My mind just went blank, Jed. What's the very large river in South America? The Amazon River, okay? So, you'd think it would be equivalent of things like that, okay? For Nineveh to be dry like a wilderness would be just as dramatic a change, okay? Verse 14, flocks shall lie down in the midst of her. Now, if you remember, and I'm assuming you don't, that's okay, but when we talked about Nineveh, we talked about how there were large walls and fortifications, and there were actually, the walls were very spread out, and within the city walls there would be pasture land and grazing land, and so they could easily sustain life for a long time in that. But Nineveh was the capital of a world empire. It was a place of large buildings, of large palaces. It was a place of wealth and all of that. Now look at the description in verses 14 and 15. Flocks shall lie down in the midst of her. All the beasts of the nations, both the cormorant and the bittern shall lodge in the upper lintels of it. Their voice shall sing in the windows. Desolation shall be in the thresholds, for he shall uncover the cedar work. The cormorant, a lot of the commentators say that that's maybe a pelican, some sort of a bird. The bittern is probably more of a walking on all fours type of a critter. It's very interesting, depending on which Bible dictionary, Bible encyclopedia, or commentary you look at. They have some different ideas on what kind of critter that might be. Okay, but the point is, it went from being a well-established city and a luxurious place to being a lodging place for birds and critters. If it says they would lodge in the upper lintels, what is that? The doorways and the window casings. And it says the birds would sing in the windows. In other words, they would make their nests there because it wasn't used by people. Desolation shall be in the thresholds. It would be, everything is going to be evacuated. It's going to be what we would think of as, just a total waste area. That's what would happen when God brings His judgment. Verse 15, this is the rejoicing city that dwelt carelessly. Okay, what does careless mean? You heard the expression, they don't have a care in the world, and they don't have a burden, they don't have a concern. That was a description of Nineveh. In fact, it's interesting, that was also the description of Babylon, right? They were fortified and had a river, and when Daniel was there, and eventually Babylon was captured, but many, many, many times they got to the place of dominance in the world where they felt like they were untouchable, unchallengeable. And so they were living very securely, living carelessly, that said in her heart, I am, and there is none beside me. So that was her heart. I am at the top of the food chain, if I could say it that way. I am in charge. No, there is no challenger. There's none beside me. United States, ever guilty of thinking that way? Yeah. If history's any guide, we would do well not to be overconfident in that area, right? But, they were totally secure in their own pride that everything is fine. Middle of verse 15. How is she become a desolation, a place for beasts to lie down in? Everyone that passeth by her shall hiss and wag his hand. What does that hiss mean? Does that mean, like a snake or like a cat? No, it's more like psst, right? Man, can't believe what's happened over there, right? This was, at one point in time, this was the economic center of the world, or that part of the world. There, if you wanted business, if you wanted military might, if you wanted entertainment, if you wanted goods and services, Nineveh is the place. And yet, God is saying here that He is going to bring judgment, and it will end up being a wilderness. It'll be a place for wild animals and birds to live, but there won't be any people there. We do well to look at that and say, Lord, help us to listen, before we get to that point, because that's exactly what's going to happen here in the first section of chapter 3. But in chapter 2, you have a pronouncement of God's judgment on the heathen in these different groups. In chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, you had a call for repentance by God. And then in verses 4 through 15, north, south, east, west, all of those groups are mentioned as candidates for God's judgment. Then that brings us to chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. The next section here is God's judgment on Jerusalem and Judah. All right, let's read verses 1 through 7 together just to get the flow, and we'll go back verse by verse and discuss it. Woe to her that is filthy and polluted, to the oppressing city. She obeyed not the voice. She received not correction. She trusted not in the Lord. She drew not near to her God. Her princes within her are roaring lions. Her judges are evening wolves. They gnaw not the bones till the morrow. Her prophets are light and treacherous persons. Her priests have polluted the sanctuary. They've done violence to the law. The just Lord is in the midst thereof. He will not do iniquity. Every morning doth He bring His judgment to light. He faileth not, but the unjust knoweth no shame. I've cut off the nations. Their towers are desolate. I made their streets waste, that none passeth by. Their cities are destroyed, so that there is no man and there is none inhabitant. I said, surely thou wilt fear me. Thou wilt receive instruction, so their dwelling should not be cut off. Howsoever I punished them. But they arose early and corrupted all their doings. does the tone of what we've just read sound like God is rejoicing in, all right, I'm getting ready to put the hammer to you? No, there's sorrow, there's regret, there's, we hurt, we could say those things. There's love is what that means, right? God loved these people and He did not delight in bringing judgment. But the next section here, verses 1 through 7, is God's judgment directed towards Jerusalem. Now remember, when Zephaniah is preaching, this is 625, 620 BC, along in there. This is only 15 to 20 years before Babylon comes in and captures Jerusalem. The captivity happened in 3 stages, but the first stage happened in 605 BC. So this is just 15 or 20 years before God brings that hammer of Babylon down on them. It says, "Woe to her that is filthy and polluted, to the oppressing city." Now, would those descriptions be accurate if Israel had followed the law that God gave to Moses? Filthy and polluted. Now, if you think about that, in the law, the Old Testament law, and I know sometimes you're like, if you're doing a read through the Bible plan, you're like, oh no, this is Leviticus, and there's this washing and this washing and this cleansing and this cleansing. But what was that? All of those things about the sacrifices and being clean and unclean, that was all to drive home a point that God is holy, right? That God doesn't tolerate sin. But if they're following God's law, are they going to be filthy and corrupted and polluted? No. So, this description in verse 1, filthy and corrupted and polluted, that's not a result of obedience to God's Word. This is a result of what? It's Sunday school, it's okay. Disobedience. It's a result of who or what have they been worshiping and serving? All the other gods and idols and, all the prophets that we've looked at have talked about different groups, but it's different avenues of false worship. What you have here in verse 1, this is the result when they live in idolatry and in false worship. You have a city, what building was located in Jerusalem? The temple of God. Okay? And so the city that was supposed to be known for the house of God and the worship of God and the presence of God was instead known as filthy, polluted, and oppressing. So you see here in verse number 1 the guilt of Jerusalem. In verse 2, you see 4 knots. Okay? This is not tying a rope so that it won't come loose. Okay? This is 4 negatives. All right? Notice here. 4 things that Jerusalem had failed to do. Number 1, she obeyed not the voice. Now that is a very accurate, very literal translation. Okay? What voice? Was it the, loudspeaker in the store? Obviously not. Okay? Obeyed not the voice. Somebody said preachers. Okay? And when the preachers or the prophets are speaking, on whose behalf are they speaking? Yeah. So ultimately, when it says they obeyed not the voice, whose voice was disregarded? God's voice. Okay? Whether God speaking directly or God speaking through His messengers, they obeyed not the voice. Look down in verse number 7. We've already read that, but look down there a minute. I said, surely thou wilt fear me, thou wilt receive instruction. God switches to first person here. But this is clearly, when you compare verse 2 and verse 7, this is clearly God's voice. And so what was Jerusalem was guilty of? What offenses? Well, for one, they did not obey God's voice. The next phrase, verse 2, she received not correction. That word correction means discipline or chastening. Those are other terms for it. But God chastens His children for what purpose? Okay? Does God chasten His children, that did not receive correction? He chastens His children for what purpose? Restoration. Exactly right. Okay? Hebrews 13 says we had fathers after our flesh that chastened us after their own pleasure, but He for our profit, our benefit. Okay? So, has Jerusalem at this point been under the chastening of God? I would say yes. They're already under some oppression. They don't have the freedom and all that. But whose correction would you rather learn from? Your own or somebody else's? I mean, we got brothers sitting down here on the second row. I mean, who would you rather? Would you rather receive your own punishment and learn from that, or would you rather your brother receive punishment and learn from that? Well, either way, you'd rather your brother receive punishment, right? But, I mean, it's far better to learn from somebody else's situation and not have that come down on your own head, right? Jerusalem is right there. They're next door neighbors with the northern kingdom, with Israel. Has God chastened their siblings to the north? Yeah. I mean, the northern kingdom is in captivity to Nineveh and Assyria at this point in time. Should that have been a lesson to Jerusalem and Judah? Yeah, absolutely. Okay? They didn't learn from their brother's chastening or their sister. They didn't learn from previous chastening, which is why God's going to bring additional judgment on them. But they did not obey the voice. They did not receive correction. Number 3, they did not trust. Notice the next phrase. She trusted not in the Lord. Okay, meaning that she looked elsewhere for help. Now that could be in a military sense. It's also in the sense of worship, right? They're worshiping false gods. They're not looking to the Lord for help. She trusted not in the Lord. They would have had, no doubt. I mean, this is 300 years after the time of Solomon. They would have had, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 available to them, right? Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 say, trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct thy paths. Okay? So, this is the exact opposite. Even if they didn't have Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, they did have the law, the Torah, the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, they had that. And if they couldn't look at what God had done for them and trust Him because of what He'd already done there, there's a gap in understanding, right? They did not obey, they did not receive, they did not trust. And then the last failure, the last phrase of verse number 2, she drew not near to her God. Did not draw near. This term is used several different ways in the Old Testament to draw near. It's speaking of physical proximity. In Genesis 37, it's used, and I believe that's of brothers drawing near to one another. Okay, family members. It's used of very close connection, like a man and wife kind of a thing. It's also used many, many times of drawing near to God. This same term we see in Exodus 3, where Moses sees the burning bush and he goes to investigate the burning bush. And when God first speaks to Moses, what does He say? Draw not nigh hither. Do not draw nigh. Do not draw near. Put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Okay? And this term is used, what I'm saying is it's used literally, and it's also used metaphorically, or it's used by application. But this term is used all over the Old Testament in particular, draw nigh to God, or approaching God. In the New Testament, in James chapter 4, we are told, draw nigh to God and He will draw nigh to you. Okay? So that's a term that's used all throughout the Bible. But here, which one of these here specifically condemns the worship of Baal, Ashtoreth, Molech? Are any of those indictments listed here? Okay? Are these the bad sins? If you try to ask somebody, are you a sinner? They usually go to, well, I'm a good person. I haven't killed anybody. I'm not a thief. I'm not an adulterer, whatever. They go to those big things. What are these indictments here? Disobeyed, wouldn't listen to correction, and then not acts but omissions. Did not trust, did not draw near. See, sometimes we need to evaluate our perspective and say, is my perspective God's perspective, right? Because, I'm not guilty of the big sins, so I'm okay. Here was an indictment by God for things that we are tempted to say are not that big a deal, right? Well, disobedience is kind of, yeah, it's important, but I didn't kill anybody, right? For what sin did God take the kingdom away from Saul? Was it adultery with Bathsheba? No, wait a minute, that was David. Oh, I know, it was murder. No, that was also David. For what sin did God take the kingdom away from Saul? Disobedience. Disobedience. Okay? So a lot of times we have our own ranking system that needs to be reevaluated. It needs to be brought in line with the way God evaluates things, because here God is listing out the offenses, and there's going to be more, but these are things that God knew were worthy of bringing up that we might think, that's not as big a deal, but it was. Verse 3, her princes within are roaring lions. You see here, we saw already a very similar reference in Micah chapter 3. Micah 3 and verse 3, speaking of the rulers of Israel who eat the flesh of my people and flay their skin from off them and break the bones and chop them in pieces as for a pot. Describing how those in power oppressed the people of Israel. You have here, the princes are lions. Proverbs 28:15 says, an oppressing prince is God's judgment. It's a bad thing. All right? Notice the last phrase in verse 3, her judges are evening wolves. They gnaw not the bones till the morrow. That's kind of a weird expression, isn't it? I think the idea of that is greed. Okay? They just go and they don't even leave something for tomorrow. They just devour everything right now. Okay? Just going to devour it all up. They don't even leave the bones. All right, I've had enough for now. I'll gnaw the bones tomorrow. They just devour everything. It's a description of greed and also how fully committed they were to their disobedience. Verse 4, her princes within her, verse 4, her prophets are light and treacherous persons. Now, light and treacherous. Is that, light is the opposite of darkness. That's a good thing, right? Okay, lightheartedness, laughter is good like a medicine. That's a good thing, right? But that's obviously not, I know what it means. It means they're in good shape. They're not overweight. And no, that's not what light means here either. Okay, light means reckless. Okay, it's the idea of giving no consideration. If I could make a comparison for a minute to the New Testament, 1 Timothy 3, Titus chapter 1, the pastor and deacon qualifications. One of the things that's on that list that is important is that they be sober, grave, temperate, right? Sober means serious-minded. Timothy and Titus were both told to instruct the young men, exhort to be sober-minded, it says. To be serious-minded, to take important matters of life seriously. Okay? This term here, light, is the opposite of that. Okay? It's just, carelessness, it's recklessness, it's not understanding the weight or the seriousness of situations. It's reckless or wanton. It's the opposite of sober or grave in the New Testament. And then it says, her prophets are light and treacherous. Okay? Treacherous is the opposite of what? I'll let you think with me this morning a little bit. Treacherous means, what does treacherous mean? Anybody want to venture a guess? Huh? Sneaky? To betray or to deceive? Yes, which, those are very much related concepts there. Okay? So, treacherous is the opposite of what? If somebody's sneaky, if they're going to betray me, if they're sly, that's the opposite of what? Loyalty, honesty, trustworthiness. Right? Okay? So the princes, the leadership should have been loyal, honest, and trustworthy. In fact, they were reckless and deceitful, and they would betray you. Okay? They were the opposite of trustworthy. Again, what does God expect for His children to be? Trustworthy, honest, loyal, all the other opposites that we've listed here. Okay? So God is bringing judgment on them for their disobedience, for their failure to receive instruction, but also for the behavior of the leadership. Her princes are lions, they destroy the people. Her prophets are light and treacherous persons. The princes, that would be the civil or the governmental level. The prophets were supposed to be what kind of leaders? In what realm were the prophets supposed to be leaders? Religion or spiritual realm. Very good, okay? So, in the civil government, there was corruption. In the spiritual side of things, there was corruption. And so it's all around, it's a bad thing. Look then, the rest of this verse 4. Her priests have polluted the sanctuary and done violence to the law. All right? Leviticus chapter 10 and verse 10 says, in the instruction to the priest, it says that they are to put a difference between holy and unholy. Put a difference between unclean and clean. Were the priests doing that here? The prophets? No. You know, they were polluting the sanctuary. They were allowing it to be defiled. All those things that God says, well, this corrupts and this corrupts and this corrupts, they were tolerating it. They were doing it. Notice so verses 2, 3, and 4, we have disobedience, we have a failure to seek God, we have oppression, we have light and treacherous, deceptive, untrustworthy, a lack of sobriety, a recklessness. We have pollution and done violence to the law, meaning, you know, it was the exact opposite of what God intended is what was done. Now notice the contrast in verse number 5. The just Lord is in the midst thereof. Is everything that they've been doing up to this point, the just Lord, now that is a description in verse 5, that is a description of God's character. He is just. He is righteous. Okay? He does that which is right. Okay? Everything that's been described in verses 1 through 4, does that agree with the character of their God? Or is that the opposite of the character of their God? It's the opposite of the character of their God. The people were supposed to reflect their God, when in fact they were living the exact opposite way. The just Lord is in the midst thereof. He will not do iniquity. Okay? God will not sin by choice. He cannot sin by nature. God is holy. He is righteous. But you have the contrast now. God is just. God will not sin. Notice again in verse 5, every morning doth He bring His judgment to light. When do the evildoers typically operate? In the morning? At night. When does God operate? In the daytime. Okay, so you have another contrast. God works in the daytime in contrast to the wicked who prefer to operate in the darkness. Verse 5, every morning doth He bring His judgment to light. He faileth not. Judgment in this sense is like it would be used in Psalm 119. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. It is His declaration of that which is right, that which should be done. So every day God is bringing His judgments to light, His pronouncement of what is right, His righteous sentence on the actions of man. Now notice the next phrase in verse number 5, He faileth not. Could you count on these princes and on these prophets? Is God faithful? I mean, that's another way to say this. He faileth not. Another way to say this is God is faithful. Okay? He faileth not. Verse 5, but the unjust knoweth no shame. That does not mean that they didn't understand what it means, but rather everything that God has done did not bring them to the point of shame. The wicked never repent of his evil deeds. He never feels shame over his actions or how he stands before God as a result of his sin. He never responds to the everyday message. What does verse 5 say? Every morning doth He bring His judgment to light. Every day God is putting forth His truth, and every day the wicked refuses to respond to it. So the everyday message from the God who is just, the just Lord that's introduced in verse number 5, there never brought about shame. It never brought the appropriate response on behalf of the people. They should have been ashamed before their God. They should have fallen on their face and asked for God's forgiveness. They should have tried to be restored to a right relationship, but the wicked knoweth no shame. All right, that's the idea here. Not that they don't know what it means, but rather they didn't even care. They didn't, they didn't have a sense of shame before God over what they'd done. So, do people that live in this condition deserve God's judgment? I mean, Israel might have been hearing the message in chapter 2. God's going to judge the Philistines. God's going to judge Moab and Ammon. God's going to judge Ethiopia. God's going to judge Assyria. Yeah. Guess what? You're living the same way. God is just, and His children will not escape that same situation either. Now, if you look back at chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, God is begging them, hey, please get right with me. What we see in verses 8 through 20 in the end of this chapter is a time of future restoration. God is merciful. But right now, what we're seeing is God's people were guilty. Now, what's the take home for you and me? The take home is we need to just say, Lord, am I guilty of the same thing they are? You know, Lord, am I guilty of not obeying, not receiving correction, not trusting, not drawing near? Am I guilty of being like a ravening lion? Am I guilty of being light and treacherous? You know, in other words, Lord, are there things in my life that are opposite of your character and what you want? If there are, would you show me? Would you help me to live in a way that's pleasing to you? That's the takeaway for you and me, because if we don't want the judgment they got, then we better not live in the same manner as which they lived, right? I know none of us, that's our goal. I want to get God's judgment, or I want to, but you know, there's times when we can deceive ourselves. There's times when we can kind of, you know, get off the beaten path, and it does us good every once in a while. Just say, Lord, this isn't me, is it? If it is, would you show me? Because I want to be where I'm supposed to be. All right, we will leave off there and pick up there. There was one more thing I wanted to tell you, but I wanted to tell you at the end of the Sunday school time rather than at the beginning. I appreciate all of you who have prayed for my family. The last 3 years have been a difficult time. About 5 o'clock this morning, my brother went to be with the Lord. So we don't know any of the other arrangements at this point. He did get sick. They took him to the hospital on Friday and Saturday. The blessing is that his wife was able to visit him in the hospital on Saturday. But we knew the illness was serious at that point in time. But we've been praying that the Lord would heal him or take him home. And He healed him by taking him home. So I know a lot of you have been faithful to pray for him, and we really appreciate that. I know Rachel and the kids would appreciate your prayers now. We'll let Pastor know, later on down the line I don't know anything else right now. So, but anyway, I know many of you benefited from their ministry, loved their family, and I appreciate it very much, more than you know. And I know the family would appreciate your prayers. All right, let's close our Sunday school hour in a word of prayer. Brother Jeremy, would you close us in prayer, please? Yes. Yes. Amen. You're dismissed.